Last fall, in a quiet suburb just outside Chicago, Henry Thompson was living his usual life. At 68, he was the kind of guy who'd spend his Saturdays tending to his backyard garden, sipping iced tea while the radio played old rock tunes. Most nights, though, you'd find him parked in his recliner, cheering on the Chicago Cubs with a bowl of popcorn in hand. Henry wasn't what you'd call unhealthy. Sure, he'd slowed down a bit, his knees creaking when he climbed the stairs, but he still mowed his own lawn and walked the dog every morning. To his wife Clara and their two grown kids, he seemed like the same old Henry, steady as ever. October 14th started like any other day. The Cubs were playing the Cardinals, a big rivalry game, and Henry wasn't about to miss it. He'd been talking about it all week, even betting Clara $5 his team would pull through. Clara cooked up a feast that night, bratwurst and fries, Henry's favorite game day combo. They laughed through dinner, swapping stories about the time he took the kids to Wrigley Field and spilled soda all over his lap. By the time the game ended, Cubs up by 2, Henry was grinning ear to ear. It was a chilly night, the kind where the leaves crunch underfoot and you can see your breath in the air. Henry stayed up a little later than usual, winding down with his routine, nothing out of the ordinary. Around 11:30, he kissed Clara goodnight, turned off the bedroom lamp, and settled in. The next morning, Clara woke up to the smell of coffee brewing downstairs, her usual alarm clock. She rolled over, expecting to see Henry's side of the bed empty, him already up fiddling with the toaster. But there he was, still lying there, perfectly still. She nudged him gently, calling his name. "Henry, you gonna sleep all day?" No response. A cold chill ran down her spine as she shook him harder, her voice trembling now. "Henry, wake up." He didn't move, didn't stir, didn't breathe. Clara's hands flew to her phone, dialing 911, her heart pounding so loud she could barely hear the operator. By the time the paramedics arrived, it was too late. Henry was gone. The family was in shock, reeling from the suddenness of it all. Henry hadn't been sick, not really, no heart attacks or cancer scares in his past. The doctors called it natural causes, but that didn't sit right with Clara. How could a man so full of life just slip away like that? Days later, sitting in their quiet living room, Clara replayed that last night in her head. Had she missed something? A sign, a clue? She kept asking herself, what happened to him? Could we have stopped it? It wasn't until the autopsy report came back that the pieces started falling into place. Henry's death wasn't random. It was tied to something so ordinary, so ingrained in his nightly habits, that no one had ever questioned it. 5 little routines, things he'd done for years, had silently stacked the odds against him. You see, after 65, your body doesn't play by the same rules anymore. What feels harmless in your 40s or 50s can turn into a ticking time bomb as you age. Henry didn't know it, but those bedtime habits were chipping away at his health, night after night. Clara couldn't shake the guilt, wishing she'd known sooner, wishing she'd seen the danger lurking in their cozy little routine. But the truth is, most folks over 65 don't realize it either. These habits sneak up on you, quiet as a shadow, until it's too late. So what were these 5 things Henry did that cost him his life? Stick with me, because we're about to dig into them, one by one. They're not big dramatic vices, they're small, everyday choices you might be making right now. Before we dig deeper, I'd love to hear from you. Where are you tuning in from? If these insights about living stronger past 65 hit home, share your thoughts below and consider subscribing. Things are heating up and you won't want to miss what's next. First up, there's the way Henry liked to unwind after a long day. Then, those late-night habits he picked up over the years, thinking they'd help him sleep. And don't get me started on what he ate before bed. It's a game changer. By the end of this story, you'll see exactly what went wrong for Henry, and more importantly, what you can do to dodge the same fate. This isn't just about scare tactics. It's about giving you the tools to wake up stronger every morning. Clara wishes she'd had that chance with Henry. Let's start with the night of October 14th, that crisp fall evening when everything seemed so normal. Henry had no idea what was coming, and neither did Clara. But looking back, the signs were there. hiding in plain sight. He'd cracked open a bottle of red wine after the game. Just one glass, he said, to take the edge off. It was a ritual he'd picked up in his 60s, something to help him relax. To him, it was as harmless as a cup of chamomile tea. But here's the kicker: alcohol doesn't play nice with your body after 65. Studies from the Mayo Clinic show it messes with your sleep cycles, especially that deep REM sleep your brain needs to recharge. For Henry, it was the first domino to fall. Then there was his phone, that little glowing screen he couldn't put down. He'd scroll through sports highlights, texting his buddies about the Cubs' big win, sometimes until midnight. Clara used to tease him about it, calling him a night owl. Except that blue light pouring into his eyes wasn't doing him any favors. Research in the Journal of Gerontology says it suppresses melatonin, the hormone that tells your body it's time to rest. At 68, Henry's system couldn't handle that kind of disruption. And that dinner, oh man, those bratwurst and fries hit the spot, but they hit hard. He ate late, real late, maybe 10 p.m., because the game ran long. His stomach was still churning when he climbed into bed, a detail Clara didn't think twice about. There's more to it, though, two other habits that sealed the deal. One had to do with how he propped himself up in bed, the other with a sound Clara heard every night but never worried about. Together, they turned a good man's rest into his last. Henry's story isn't unique. It's happening in homes across America, maybe even yours. Over 65, your body's more fragile than you think, and those cozy bedtime routines can betray you. Clara learned that the hard way. So here's the deal. We're peeling back the curtain on those 5 habits, starting with what Henry did right after that Cubs game. You'll be surprised how something so small can spiral into something so big. Let's dive in. Henry Thompson's last night didn't feel like a countdown. It was just another evening in his Chicago suburb home, the glow of the TV still fading as he climbed into bed. But beneath that cozy routine, trouble was brewing, starting with a glass of red wine. He'd poured it right after the Cubs beat the Cardinals, a little victory sip, he called it. At 68, Henry figured a single glass couldn't hurt. It was his way of unwinding after a long day. Clara didn't mind. She'd seen him do it for years, especially when his team won. Here's the thing, though, alcohol hits different after 65. The Mayo Clinic says even a small amount can mess with your sleep cycles, cutting into that deep REM stage your body craves. For Henry, it wasn't just relaxing him, it was quietly stressing his system. See, as you age, your liver slows down. It doesn't clear alcohol as fast. That glass of wine lingered in his blood, making his breathing shallow while he slept. Studies show this can spike your risk of sleep apnea, a condition where you stop breathing for seconds at a time. Henry didn't know it, but that harmless drink was setting off a chain reaction. His brain couldn't fully rest, his oxygen levels dipped, and his heart had to work harder to keep up. Clara remembers him tossing a little that night, but she thought he was just dreaming about the game. Then there was his phone, that trusty little sidekick he couldn't let go of. After his wine, Henry sprawled out in bed, scrolling through ESPN highlights, texting his buddy Dave about the Cubs' clutch homer. Midnight came and went, his eyes glued to the screen. Clara used to nag him about it. Put that thing down, you're not 20 anymore. He'd laugh her off, saying he'd sleep when he was tired, no big deal. But that blue light pouring into his eyes was a bigger deal than either of them realized. The Journal of Gerontology has the receipts. Prolonged screen time before bed tanks your melatonin levels. That's the hormone that tells your body it's time to shut down. And at 68, Henry's melatonin production was already on the decline. He was robbing himself of rest without even knowing it. What's worse, that late-night scrolling kept his brain buzzing when it should have been winding down. His heart rate stayed up, his blood pressure too, all while his body begged for calm. Over time, that kind of strain adds up, especially for a guy pushing 70. Clara noticed he'd wake up groggy some mornings, rubbing his eyes like he hadn't slept a wink. She'd ask if he was okay, and he'd shrug, just getting old, I guess. Neither of them connected the dots to that glowing screen he loved so much. And then there was dinner, that hearty plate of bratwurst, and fries he polished off around 10 p.m. The game ran late, so they ate late. No harm done, right? Henry savored every bite, washing it down with a Coke, his stomach full and happy. But happy for Henry didn't mean happy for his body. After 65, your metabolism isn't what it used to be, digestion takes longer, and lying down right after a big meal is a recipe for trouble. That night, his stomach was still working overtime when he hit the pillow. Acid reflux was the first domino to fall, a burning sensation he'd sometimes complain about. Clara remembers him coughing once or twice before drifting off, but it didn't seem serious. She'd hand him a Tums now and then, figuring it was just indigestion. Except it wasn't just indigestion, it was a warning sign. The American Heart Association links late-night eating to higher blood pressure and heart strain, especially in older adults. Henry's heart was pumping harder than it should have been, all while he slept. Think about it. His body was busy breaking down greasy fries instead of resting. That extra workload pushed his system into a restless state, nowhere near the deep sleep he needed. Over months, years, those late dinners were quietly wearing him out. Clara recalls a few nights when he'd wake up clutching his chest, saying it felt tight. Probably just the spicy mustard. He'd joke, brushing it off with a grin. She wishes she'd pushed him to see a doctor, but who thinks fries could kill you? These three habits, wine, phone, food, they sound innocent enough, don't they? For Henry, they were part of who he was, little comforts he'd earned after a long life. But at 68, they weren't comforts anymore, they were traps. The autopsy would later show how they all teamed up against him, but we're not there yet. That night, as he lay there, his body was already fighting a losing battle, and two more habits were waiting to tip the scales. Clara had no idea what was coming. Let's rewind to Henry's wine glass for a sec, that ruby red pour he loved so much. It wasn't just about sleep, it was dehydrating him too, thickening his blood overnight. Pair that with a racing heart, and you've got a cardiovascular storm brewing. Now picture him scrolling, that blue light tricking his brain into staying awake. His eyes might have been heavy, but his mind was still at the ballpark, replaying the game. It's a habit so many of us have, yet it's silently stealing our health. And those fries, sitting heavy in his gut, they weren't just a late-night treat. They were spiking his blood sugar, stressing his arteries, all while he thought he was winding down. At 65 plus, your body can't bounce back like it used to. Clara still sees him in that recliner, cheering for the Cubs, so full of life. She never imagined his nighttime routine was chipping away at that spark. But it was one sip, one scroll, one bite at a time. These weren't wild vices, no smoking or reckless living here. They were normal, everyday things Henry did without a second thought. That's what makes them so sneaky, so dangerous after 65. You might be wondering, am I doing this too? Maybe you've got a glass of wine by your bed right now, or your phone's lighting up your face. Henry's story isn't just his. It could be yours, or your dad's, or your neighbor's. The scariest part? Henry didn't feel sick. He didn't look sick. He just went to sleep. 3 habits down, 2 to go, and they're even closer to home than you'd think. Clara's about to realize how deep this rabbit hole goes. By the time Henry's head hit the pillow, his body was already out of whack. Wine messed with his breathing, screens messed with his brain, food messed with his heart, and the night wasn't done with him yet. Clara slept right beside him, oblivious to the chaos unfolding inches away. She'd hear him shift, maybe mumble about the game, but nothing alarming. That's the thing about these habits. They don't wave red flags until it's too late. So here we are, halfway through Henry's last night, 3 traps sprung. The next 2 would seal his fate, and they're habits you've probably never questioned either. Let's keep going, because this is where it gets real. Henry Thompson was already in deep water by the time he climbed into bed that October night. The wine, the phone, the late-night fries, they'd set the stage for trouble, but 2 more habits were about to take it over the edge. Clara slept beside him, unaware of the storm brewing in his body. Let's talk about how Henry propped himself up in bed. It's not something you'd think twice about. He loved stacking 2 big pillows, one on top of the other, so he could sit up and watch late-night reruns of SportsCenter. It felt comfy, like a little throne for the king of his castle. Clara would tease him, "You look like you're ready to give a speech." He'd just chuckle, adjusting his pillows until he found that perfect angle. To them, it was just Henry being Henry, quirky and set in his ways. But here's where it gets dicey. Those high pillows weren't doing his neck any favors. After 65, your spine and blood vessels aren't as forgiving, and stacking pillows like that can kink your arteries. The American Stroke Association says it can cut blood flow to your brain, quietly raising your stroke risk. That night, Henry's head was tilted just so, his neck craned forward while he watched highlights. His carotid arteries, the ones feeding oxygen to his brain, were under pressure he didn't feel. Over time, that kind of strain builds up, and at 68, his body couldn't shrug it off anymore. Clara remembers him rubbing his neck some mornings, saying it felt stiff. She'd offer to grab the heating pad, but he'd wave her off. "It's nothing, just slept funny." Funny turned out to be fatal, and neither of them saw it coming. Add that to the wine slowing his system, the phone jacking up his heart rate, the fries clogging his gut, and you've got a perfect storm. Henry's brain wasn't getting the oxygen it needed. His circulation was off, all because of a couple of pillows. It sounds wild, but it's true. Then there's the fifth habit, the one that sealed his fate, his snoring. Henry had always been a snorer, a loud, rumbling soundtrack to Clara's nights for decades. She'd nudge him to roll over, and he'd grumble, "It's just how I sleep, hon." To Clara, it was background noise, like the hum of the fridge downstairs. She figured it was normal. Plenty of folks snore as they get older, right? Even their kids used to giggle about dad sounding like a lawnmower. But that snoring wasn't just noise. It was a red flag waving in the dark. The National Sleep Foundation says loud, irregular snoring can signal sleep apnea, where your airway collapses and you stop breathing for seconds at a time. At 68, Henry's throat muscles weren't as strong, and gravity wasn't helping. That night, Clara heard the usual rumble, maybe a little louder than normal. There'd be pauses, long stretches of silence, then a sudden gasp as he caught his breath. She didn't think much of it, half asleep herself, assuming he'd settled down. Except he didn't settle. Those pauses were his body fighting for air. Each time he stopped breathing, his oxygen levels dropped, his heart racing to compensate. Studies in the Journal of Gerontology link untreated sleep apnea to a 30% higher risk of sudden cardiac death in older adults. Henry's heart was already stretched thin from the wine, the screen time, the heavy meal, the bad posture. Those snoring gaps pushed it past the breaking point, night after night, until October 14th became the last straw. Clara slept through the battle, inches away. She'd noticed he seemed tired lately, dragging his feet more than usual. "You okay, babe?" She'd ask, and he'd nod, "Just need a good nap." That exhaustion wasn't laziness. It was his body screaming for help. The crazy part? Henry didn't have a clue anything was wrong. He didn't wake up choking or gasping, at least not enough to alarm him. Sleep apnea is a silent killer, creeping up on you while you dream about the Cubs winning the World Series. Clara wishes she'd paid attention to those snores, maybe pushed him to see a doctor. She'd read somewhere that snoring could be serious, but it felt like one of those overhyped health scares. Now she knows better. Too late for Henry. Put it all together, and that night was a ticking clock. The wine dulled his breathing. The phone kept him restless. The fries taxed his heart. The pillows choked his blood flow, and the snoring cut off his air. 5 habits, 5 strikes, and Henry was out. He didn't look sick, didn't act sick, just went to bed like always. Clara kissed him goodnight, turned off the lamp, and drifted off, never imagining she'd wake up alone. It's the kind of story that hits you in the gut because it's so damn ordinary. You might be thinking, wait, I stack my pillows too, or my husband snores like that. These aren't rare habits. They're in millions of bedrooms across America. Henry's not some outlier. He's the guy next door. The autopsy would spell it out clear as day, but we're getting there. For now, picture Henry lying there, his chest still, while Clara slept on, oblivious. Those 5 routines had been stacking up for years, waiting for the right night to cash in. Clara replays it over and over, the what-ifs piling up like those pillows. Could she have swapped his wine for tea, hidden his phone, turned down the TV? She didn't know then, but she's learning now, and it's tearing her apart. These habits aren't loud. They don't announce themselves with sirens. They're quiet, cozy, part of the fabric of life after 65. That's what makes them so deadly. They feel like friends until they're not. Henry's story could have ended differently if only someone had sounded the alarm. 5 little things, 5 chances to save him, slipping through the cracks of a normal night. Clara's left holding the pieces, wondering how it all went so wrong. That snoring, though, that's the one that haunts her most. She can still hear it, echoing in the empty bedroom, a sound she'll never unhear. It wasn't just noise, it was Henry's last cry for help. And those pillows, they're still on the bed, mocking her every time she walks by. She didn't know a simple stack could stack the odds against him. Now she sees it everywhere, in every late-night habit they shared. So here we are, October 14th, the night Henry's luck ran out. 5 habits converged, a perfect storm in a quiet suburb, and took him away. But this isn't the end. Not yet. Clara's got one more chapter to write.